Hey guys, what is going on? So I wanted to talk about isolation lifts and how you can maximize your results while doing them. And I kind of want to talk about some of the mistakes that I've made in the past and I see a lot of other people make where they aren't able to maximize the hypertrophy that they should be getting from these isolation lifts. And I would kind of summarize this in general as being treating these isolation lifts as kind of an afterthought or quote unquote accessory lift and not treating them with the same importance as you do with a compound lift. And let's be clear, guys, most of your muscle is going to be gained from compound lifts. You're working multiple muscle groups, you're getting the most bang for your buck. And, if you're a power lifter and you care about your numbers and stuff like that, obviously doing bench press, doing squat, doing deadlift, any, compound lift in general, that's going to give you the best results overall. And so attacking those lifts and really making sure that your form is correct, making sure that you're really focusing on progressive overload, I think that's something that everybody does, okay? So it's not really something that needs to be emphasized to the same degree because it's something that people already find important. Now, isolation lifts, oftentimes are thought of as an afterthought in terms of power lifters just doing them as like accessory lifts, or maybe, you're not focused on progressive overload to the same degree because you just want to have that mind-muscle connection. You just want to get a good pump, a good contraction, and you're not actually treating that lift like it's one of your most important lifts. And sure, like I said, you're going to build most of your muscle just building that base, doing the compound lifts, but to really eke out, that next level of muscle growth in a certain area, you're going to need to do isolation lifts and you're going to need to perform them with an immense level of focus, taking it close to failure, really isolating the lift. And in fact, the mental energy that you have to have on these isolation lifts, I would argue, is significantly higher than something like a bench press or a squat or a deadlift. Oftentimes, these lifts are done so frequently, they're so emphasized, and there's a standard across the board on how they should look that people aren't cheating these reps, and people know that they need to do progressive overload because it's in everybody's best interest to have the best numbers on those lifts as possible, right? If you aren't progressively overloading, you're not adding weight to the bar on a bench press, your bench press is going to be weak, okay? That's just the reality of the situation. So nobody's going to intentionally train in a way where their bench press or their squat or their deadlift is going to be weak because they want to have that, high number. And in terms of the kind of rep quality that we expect out of a bench press, you got to touch your chest. Some people, you got to pause the bench press, right? There's a certain level of, this is what you need to do. For a squat, you got to make sure that you hit depth. If you're doing an ATG squat, you want to make sure that you hit that depth. If you're doing a deadlift, you make sure that you lock out the lift, right? There's a certain standard to the rep quality of these lifts, and there's this understanding that there needs to be progressive overload on these lifts to be able to get bigger and stronger. Everybody knows this. And people really emphasize those lifts and want to maximize them. Now with accessory lifts, there's such a range in terms of, how much weight are you using on the machine? How slow are you going with your eccentrics? You're doing it as a bodybuilding lift. So people don't really care about how much weight they're doing on those. They're not focusing on progressive overload to the same degree. They're not focusing on their rep quality to the same degree and making sure that it's consistent. Because if they are trying to progressively overload on the lift, odds are they're significantly sacrificing their rep quality, or maybe they're bringing in other muscles into the group that's going to allow them to lift more weights, right? Like if you're doing a bench press, you don't care if you're not isolating your chest. You're just trying to lift the most weight possible. So if you can cheat the rep in any way, it doesn't really matter in that context. Now, if you do a bicep curl and you're using your legs and you're using all this inertia to lift the weight when it's trying to target your biceps, well, that is actually a big deal because you're trying to make sure that you're isolating that muscle, and you want to make sure that the progressive overload that you're actually, putting on in your program, you want to make sure that that's actually the muscle doing the work, the muscle actually getting stronger. On the flip side, you also really want to take your isolation lifts close to or at failure or even beyond failure to get that maximum hypertrophy response from them. It's safer to do it on isolation lifts. The whole goal of isolation lifts is for hypertrophy. It's not to get the maximum bench press possible. It's not to move the most weight. Your goal is to have the most, biggest hypertrophy response that you can, okay? So having this idea of just, okay, I want to go in and do these lifts with, either terrible technique and I want to progress in terms of weight, or I'm not worried about progressing in weight and therefore I don't take them seriously. I'm not constantly trying to progressively overload, or your reps look different all the time from set to set. There's no consistency there. So really treating that lift with, again, not only as much focus as a compound lift, but actually really emphasizing and having maximum focus, focusing on your rep quality, making sure that there's a certain level of intensity, making sure that you're getting, close to pass failure, whatever it needs to be. All of that takes much more mental energy and making sure that you're isolating the muscle that you actually want. And if you're not doing all of those things, the odds of you actually getting, a maximum hypertrophy response from that lift go down and down and down. Okay, so there needs to be a maximum amount of focus when you're doing these lifts, and they kind of need to be prioritized even above these compound lifts, especially as you get more advanced, and those compound lifts won't be giving you the same muscle growth results that they did back when you were a beginner and really building your base. Okay, so there's that aspect of it. And then this is the other side of the coin, treating these like they can just be maximized with volume. Now, the issue with this is not that you can't recover from an kind of insane amount of volume from these isolation lifts, because they don't induce as much fatigue. So a lot of people like myself have just pushed the volume. It's like, oh, I got to grow my triceps. I'm going to do reps and sets and reps and sets and so much volume on these lifts. And while that is not really going to affect your overall fatigue as much as doing those, same practices with compound lifts, the problem there is that you're unintentionally pacing yourself and you're not giving it the maximum intensity, maximum focus that you could otherwise achieve by doing way less volume. So you really, really want to work in a rep range where you can maximize hypertrophy and really get the most potent stimulus possible. And this doesn't need to be 40 sets a week. Now, there's a time and a place to have really high volume, and I'm not saying that you can't do that style of training. What I'm saying is when volume comes at the expense of focus, intensity, taking it to true failure, not just, oh, it's getting hard, I feel the burn, I'm going to stop this set because it's one of my 20 sets that I'm going to do. You really, really want to focus on getting the maximum amount out of each set. And again, this results in you actually putting a lot more emphasis on these accessory lifts or, isolation lifts, whatever you want to call them. It takes a lot more effort to really be consistent and to really get what you want out of them relative to a compound lift. Okay, so I've always had this reverse. I've always emphasized my compound lifts above, and then it's kind of an afterthought with the isolations. Or if I'm really like, oh, the isolations are going to build, my triceps or something like that, well, let me just do a ton of sets. Let me do a ton of volume. Let me really hammer these. When each set that you're doing is kind of just more junk volume, when in reality, you could have a very intense, you could do one set and get a really potent response if you really take it close to failure, really, have a consistent standard when it comes to your form, and really, again, just treating those as if they're as important, if not, my argument is that they should be treated as if they're more important than your compound lifts. So hopefully that can help you guys actually take these accessories, take these isolation lifts, and take them to the next level and really actually focus on progressive overload and really taking it to that maximum level where you can get the hypertrophy response that you want. That's how I'm currently taking, my isolation lifts. That's how I'm, treating them. And I really want them to get me that hypertrophy response. And I think it's working out pretty well so far. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I'll keep you updated and I'll talk to you soon.